Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And in a move that will surprise absolutely nobody, including myself, I'm talking a bit about the Booker Prize here. So last year, after reading the long list and just after the shortlist was announced, I did something that, thanks to Larry Has Opinions, I sort of named the Booker B-Sides, which was basically other books by the shortlisted authors from that year's Booker Prize. Quite luckily last year for that, all of them had written previous books, so that there's music playing. There we go. So that was incredibly easy and kind of meant that there were books that I could talk about for that. However, for the 2022 one, I was nervous going into it because I thought that one of the two debuts on the list, Maps of Our Spectacular Bodies or Night Crawling, were going to make it, and neither of them did. And so we are left with a short list of authors who have all written other books before. So I'm going to be talking about one book from each of them that I've read separately, and let's get talking about those. First up is NoViolet Bulawayo with We Need New Names, and this was shortlisted for the 2013 Booker Prize. And also at one point there is a moment in Glory where she says something like, with all of this considered, we need new names. And I was like, hang on, NoViolet, what are you doing here? But it's interesting to note because these two books are very, very different. Glory is a little bit more sort of bombastic and epic and is sort of intentionally quite playful and silly and funny. And We Need New Names is a little bit more sort of not straight-laced, that's not the term. It's sort of a more standard traditional novel in many ways. It hasn't got the sort of the key part at the heart of it like Glory does, but I still found this book really quite affecting. It talks about, we sort of follow a young 10-year-old and we sort of see basically a lot about how Zimbabwe is changing around her. And what I thought was especially effective within this was how we slowly watch things change on the landscape. And because we're seeing it through a 10-year-old's eyes, often there are things that don't really make sense to her or to us, or we know that things are coming. But there's also a lot in that book, I think, about power dynamics, because at one point we have this visiting group of people from outside and they bring T-shirts and they've got these other things, and all the locals are meant to be incredibly grateful for all of these gifts that have been brought over, but really they're left with sort of some discarded leftover T-shirts or whatever from from rich white tourists coming there, or from other people coming in and sort of treating them like, oh, these poor Zimbabweans. And I think there's something so wonderfully punchy about the way that NoViolet Bulawayo writes that section, especially of this kind of, almost like looking to the camera and being like, I know, right? This is ridiculous. That I found really, really interesting. And so it's a really fun book to try out, I think. And I see why it was shortlisted in 2013. But let's move on to some of the other authors as well. Next up, we have Percival Everett, and he was shortlisted this year for his book The Trees, a biting, sarcastic, very funny, but very clever look at race and particularly sort of history. And we have Erasure by him, which is a biting, sarcastic, very clever, very funny look at race and publishing. And so I just finished this about 20 minutes before I started doing this video. This is very fresh and I adored this. This is easily one of the most incredible books I've read in a while. This is deeply, very, very funny, very, very dark. Essentially, the main premise behind this book is that we have this this black professor, or sort of, yeah, he's an author. He's sort of he works in universities. He writes these very intellectual papers. He's very sort of, he sort of is among some of the sort of academic elite. But his novels themselves don't really sell because they're seen as sort of too high concept or whatever. And his publisher sort of says, hey, look, there's this, like, do you remember that other book you wrote that was really real? And by real, it's very much sort of, he sort of reads this as being black, like, can you talk a bit more about being black, essentially, is how it's framed. And so this novel, Erasure, is entirely then around how he sort of tries to sort of parody the whole system. So he writes a book that is originally called My Pathology, with an F, but is sort of eventually changed to the F word as its name. And the whole reasoning behind this is basically a woman publishes a book that is sort of, he sees that our main character, Thelonious Monk, sees as a complete parody of how black Southerners in the US speak. He sees this as basically being like a complete parody of how people talk, but it's lapped up particularly by white audiences, and it goes on to be a huge bestseller. So he sort of sarcastically and as a bit of a protest writes a book that's very much how he sees as sort of another parody of how, you know, written entirely in a sort of African-American dialect that's very, very specific. And as he mentions in the book, he doesn't know anybody who speaks like that. But he sort of writes this as a bit of a joke. But it goes on to be picked up massively by publishers. And then he's suddenly in this situation where he's written a book under a pseudonym that is a complete parody, but that loads of audiences are buying and saying, wow, you know, I really feel like I understand the African-American experience now because of reading this book. And he's making millions from this. So it's this really bizarre sort of circumstance. And it's so clever because we basically get 80 pages of this book are that novel. And it's so funny to read a novel within a novel, and particularly such a parody one at that. So I adored this. I thought this was so funny, really, really clever and biting in how it talks about this idea of authenticity. So, you know, when Thelonious Monk is sort of talking in academic, you know, like high level academic language, people see that as inauthentic and see him as not being black enough, in very heavy inverted commas. But then when he writes this sort of complete parody, which sounds like nobody he's ever spoken to, people suddenly tell him how authentic and raw and real this is. And in the meantime, there's a lot going on with his family as well. So I absolutely loved this. I thought this was so, so funny and so clever, and really, really highly recommend it as well. Next up, Alan Garner. So shortlisted this year for Treacle Walker, which has probably raised more eyebrows than probably a few others on this list for just being a pretty bizarre book to pin down. You know, a sort of a wild kind of, a very short book that's sort of in myths and fairy tales and is at times completely, like, feels really impenetrable, but that's part of the appeal. And yeah, really, really joyous, I think, in many ways though as well. My favourite thing about Treacle Walker is its ability to just enjoy the process of storytelling. It just revels in sort of telling you a story. And that's what I got with The Red Shift by him as well, which I thought was really interesting for how it has a lot of those same that's the same sort of topics almost. It feels a little bit more sort of sci-fi fantasy than Treacle Walker, which is a bit more folklore based, but it concerns this sort of relationship between these two people, and particularly how once various other complicated things start getting involved around, you know, theories around time travel and whatever else, and this very sort of sci-fi thing that starts emerging, how these two characters start to sort of relate or not relate to each other. In fact, you know, one of the characters, Tom, at the heart of the book, is sort of painfully unable at times to understand things that are going on around him. His girlfriend frequently tells him that she loves him, and he doesn't really know how to respond because that's not really part of his vocabulary, but also he doesn't really think it's relevant. He's sort of like, oh, well, that's nice. And he knows that he loves her, but he doesn't feel that saying that does anything. And so it's just this really fun book again of just sort of, you know, a short book where the author is just delighting in telling you a story. And I think that's something that I'm coming to see is a fairly common thing with Alan Garner, and from what other people have said about how much they love his work, is there's just this commitment, almost like Neil Gaiman or Terry Pratchett or people like that, to kind of just telling a story and really reveling in just the delight that comes from telling and listening to a story as well. Next is Claire Keegan, shortlisted for Small Things Like These, you know, a slim book that deals with the inner lives of characters, and particularly how those lives can be so easily changed and illusions can be shattered. And in many ways, the other book of hers that I've read that I'm going to talk about, Foster, falls down very similar lines in a great way, I think. I absolutely adored this book. I read it a few months back, and I found it just so utterly profound. The idea of Foster as the name suggests, is that a young girl is sent to go and live with a foster family. And this young girl has a really great experience with this. It's a really loving environment. But sort of slowly, secrets basically start to reveal, and that starts to shatter some of these illusions. And I realise I'm being a bit vague there, mostly because I don't want to give things away. But this is, again, also a book that's about, what, like 80, 90 pages? It's tiny. But again, just like small things like these, so much is done in such a small amount of words. And it's really quite staggering, because you sort of get to about halfway through and you're like, wow, isn't this so delicately done and so beautiful and so tender? And then things start to change and we start to realize where that's going. And I mean, Claire Keegan, I'm just so sort of fascinated by, from the things I've read of her. So small things like these in Foster, sort of 2 very short novels or novellas, or some people call them short stories, whatever. And then her collections of short stories, Antarctica I've read as well, which I just thought was really quite profound for how quickly she gets to the point of something, how quickly she's sort of able to describe a whole character and their background without really having to give much more detail. And that's something I find really quite beautiful, and was so staggered by reading Foster, which I think has now been turned into a film as well. So really keen to see what that looks like and how they've sort of spun that into a full film, particularly as so much of Claire Keegan's work is sort of small glances or small moments happening that mean so much. I think that could lend itself really well to film as well. Next up, Shehan Karunatilaka, who was shortlisted this year for The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida. And his first book, Chinaman, is one that I wanted to talk about here today, which I really, really enjoyed. So 7 Moons of Mali Almeida has this sort of dreamlike quality where we're watching somebody in the final stages of their life, well, just after they've died, looking at potentially coming back from the afterlife, and affecting the world around them. And Chinaman is like such a different turn on that, but still really interesting in many, many ways. So the whole premise of Chinaman at first sounds like it would be really off-putting, because nominally it's a book largely about cricket, or so it seems, and particularly focused on one specific cricketer who is not a sort of widely known one to any character in the book, really. And so we then are kind of left with this story that I just found deeply funny. It's a book that intentionally is very aware within itself, very self-aware as a novel. So occasionally you'll read passages of things like, well, you know, we're on page 200 or so yet, and you haven't heard about this thing yet. And there's this sort of knowingness to this book that's really fun. And actually, as you get further on into the book, you start to question a bit more about what that knowingness is about. Like, is this book intentionally playing with us? Is this book a document of something else? All of this is kind of key to it, but the main story essentially is that this old cricketer, Pradeep Mathew, was this sort of figure who is well beloved by this writer who is going to write a book about his life. Originally it's looking like it's going to be a film, then it kind of gets turned into like maybe it's going to be a book, but everybody he interviews is like, I don't know who this person is. And in the meantime there's this sort of national pride sort of bound up in it, because Pradeep Mathew is Sri Lankan, and the writer is Sri Lankan, and there's a sort of importance to the Sri Lankan national image, at least that he sees of this cricketer. And potentially, you know, there aren't these other big cricketing names apparently for this author other than Pradeep Mathew who come from Sri Lanka. And so what really starts as this sort of almost like goofy kind of quest to write this book or to make this film turns into something a bit deeper, about talking about the relationship between Sri Lanka and its people, this sort of sense of national pride and national shame that kind of get bound up together with each other. And then especially as we get later and later into the book, there are several left turns of, oh, actually, maybe this book is about this other thing entirely. And we just keep moving and keep going in these completely unprecedented and completely new ways. So I thought this was really fun and really clever, and it just reminded me a lot of just the humour in 7 Moons, which was one of my favourite things about it. And in Chinaman, it's laced through every page. This book is almost a kind of an anti-book. It feels like it sort of sits along things like Don Quixote in terms of how it plays with the idea of what a novel is as it's going. So I really enjoyed this and thought this was a great fun book, and really do urge you to check it out. And last but not least, we have Elizabeth Strout, who was shortlisted this year for O. William. She's been longlisted in the past for Lucy by the Sea. The book that I wanted to talk about for her feels sort of fitting because it's one of her other big sort of series, even though it's only 2 books I think at the moment, which is Olive Kitteridge. And I did struggle a little bit with this, and I think partly that is on me because I listened to what is ostensibly a set of short stories on audio, and that's a very different, you know, a novel on audio is one thing. Short stories sometimes can mean that, you know, you end up having to stop halfway through a short story or like pick something else up later. So I recognise a bit of that's on me. But nominally, we have a set of short stories that are all interlinked, looking at Olive Kitteridge and her life. And we sort of learn about her family as a result. So we learn about the sort of her parents and how that led to some of the childhood that she experienced. We learn a little bit about sort of some of the family relationships and kind of how those have shaped the family. And we learn about various other things. There are some really quite funny and touching moments in this book. Like with O. William, she writes this with a lot of heart. There's a lot of sort of quiet beauty in a lot of these stories, of little moments where a family member can't quite communicate something to somebody, or something goes wrong and there's a secret that's held for years and years, and all of those sorts of things. But really, ultimately, I think I just found it quite just a very human and very touching book. I will say I don't think I'm enjoying this as much as I maybe have been enjoying the Lucy Barton series, the Amgash series. But I am keen to check out a bit more of her writing. I'm sure there are other ones outside of these series that are really quite enjoyable. I am also sure that something like Olive again in a more sort of novel format probably would work a bit better for me, but nonetheless, I know that for lots of people they adored this book, and I can see why. I think I maybe need to spend a little bit more time in that universe and maybe read Olive again, and see. Anyway, so those have been some sort of B-sides, as it were, to the Booker Prize shortlisted authors from this year. I am keen to go and read a few sort of books by some of the other authors who are longlisted, particularly Audrey McGee, and Hernan Diaz as well. But, you know, so many great books out there. Really, really keen to check them out. And I think actually the 2 I have physically with me here, Chinaman and Erasure by Percival Everett, I think are just both just such funny, brilliant books. Foster by Claire Keegan is also just incredible. And yeah, just really exciting times really to be introduced to some authors who I've not really read before. I think this shortlist, you know, I'd read Claire Keegan earlier in the year. I'd read small things like these right at the end of last year. I'd read some other little books before this shortlist came out, but how fun is it to kind of get introduced to brand new authors, somebody like Percival Everett or Shehan Karunatilaka, who I'd not heard of before, and sort of be given such a great chance to read some of their books. So anyway, I hope you check these out. I hope you have been enjoying reading the shortlist, and we'll find out the winner very, very soon. I hope all is well, and speak soon. Take care. Bye-bye.